Welcome back, everybody, to the Hope Axis. This is my 16th episode because, we are Eastern European women. We always have to overachieve. Otherwise, we feel that we are not living up to our potential and get into a serious depression that we pretend is seasonal, but it isn't. So just kind of on that note, I have Irina Dumitrescu here, who is one of my favorite medieval scholars and an incredible translator of the medieval mind into something that's deeply accessible to not just modern language, but modern concepts. You did an incredible Interinteract salon recently about self-help. A lot of spiritual exercises in the medieval period strongly resemble today's self-help literature, but we never really talk about it. We talk about medieval people as kind of dirty, lice-infested, or louse-infested, sorry, probably that's the most correct way to put it, brutes who live in puddles with the pigs, and sometimes build cathedrals, but that's sort of unrelated to this. Also, they reinvent mathematics and conquer parts of the world, but kind of as a side effect of them being these illiterate brutes and generally good for nothing. So I'm so grateful to you for your works, your books, teaching at the University of Bonn, medieval literature, writing a new book that I hope you will soon tell us about. But most importantly, I think that's how most people know you from your Times Literary Supplement pieces on medieval women, mostly. Few people know that the medieval period, and in some ways this was due to the church, the output of women, the intellectual output of women was quite significant, well documented, and supported by many institutions and social structures. Of course, it's way more complicated, and we will get into that. The title for this episode is Can We Understand the People of the Past? Which is a great big kind of idée fixe of mine, trying to figure it out, or obsession of mine. And we will obviously go through the medieval period, the people of the Middle Ages, to see who were they? Was there a Middle Ages even? And what did they think? Welcome, Irina. So glad to have you. I know you're calling in from Germany. So we have a big time zone difference between us. Thank you for spending your evening with me. How are you doing? And how are the medieval people doing these days in people's nations?
Thank you, Anna. Well, I think they're having a little bit of a moment lately. In the past few years, there have been a lot of books inspired by the Middle Ages, either by historical figures. Think of Lauren Groff's Matrix, which is sort of loosely inspired by Marie de France. A number of books about Margery Kempe, who I'd love to talk about, and also just reworkings of medieval literature. Arthurian literature never dies. Beowulf is back in all his broness.
I always think about the moment in Annie Hall when he advises Annie Hall that whatever you study, she wants to go back to university, just don't go somewhere where you have to read Beowulf. And I was sitting at university thinking, oh, fuck. I didn't listen to Woody Allen.
He should have been Beowulf. I'm sure he did. Yeah, even the Green Knight, right? The movie that was a couple of years ago, that I thought was really well done. So I think the Middle Ages are doing great. They're quite alive. Sometimes in stereotype, sometimes in fact, sometimes made to serve what we need today. But that's always true with the past, right? It's always filtered through our biases and our needs and the things we want from it.
I love this. I love that they are having a moment. I mean, sometimes in a not very positive way, right? When we look at accusations of neo-feudalism in some parts of the cultural and technological industries, sometimes these are invoked in a negative term. Also, we have Sarah Hayter was just on my podcast, and we talked about kind of neo-religion and people returning to the more traditional forms of faith, the structures of many of which, come from the Middle Ages. But there are a lot of, calls for Straussian reading of the classics, etc., before our viewers and listeners joined us, who were just talking about, Leo Strauss on medieval Jewish philosophy and how he read these great thinkers as, people or as texts carrying hidden meaning that she often about, doubting God, or having other religious thoughts that were not mainstream, that according to this analysis kind of are there, and you have to do some detective work to get this this content out. And on that note, I actually would like to go back to Margery Kempe, who, as I'm hearing, is having a moment. You talked at great lengths about her at the Interintact Salon, about medieval self-help. But, Margery Kempe can be discussed from so many different directions, right? Like mysticism, the first, potentially you could potentially categorize her work as the first English language autobiography. But like he had a very, vivid life of visions and creativity. Also like a wild sex life from what we can tell. Mental health and motherhood situation. An interesting social standing as well, right? Like somebody who starts out as a normie, kind of loses it midway. But also that at the core of her story, there is this great mystery, a great secret that she doesn't tell us in the text. And so leaves us with a millennium of fascination and curiosity. Like, what was that? What did Margery think? So do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about who she was, why she's interesting, how she shows up in your work, and what might she have said to this priest to freak him out so much?
So maybe it's worth just taking a step back. So Margery Kempe was a woman who lived at the end of the 14th century, start of the 15th century in England. She's in King's Lynn. It's a bustling commercial city, and she is born to a good bourgeois family. Her father was politically active, had served in all kinds of offices. She was well off, and so
Nepo baby. She's a proper Nepo baby.
If she'd had a career, she tries to a couple of businesses on her own. She tries to brew beer, which is a typical kind of woman female hustle, if you like. And she tries to mill grains, and neither of them really work out for her. But her main job is to be a married woman, and she has 14 pregnancies at least, or 14 children that she talks about at one point in the book. And that would have all been completely normal. And she's kind of vain also. She likes nice clothes. She likes to be respected in her town. It would have all been pretty normal, except she also had this religious bent. And in her, that really took the form of having really lengthy, detailed visions in which she has conversations with God the Father, with Jesus, with the various saints, with the Virgin Mary. So she has conversations with all these people. Things really seem to take off when she has a very bad pregnancy and then labor. She has what I would call a postpartum disorder. Afterwards, seems like she might kill herself. She understands it as being harassed by demons, right? And tempted by demons. And part of the problem, as you said, is that at one point she thinks she's going to die, and a priest is too hasty and won't let her confess a sin which she has on her mind. So she has this one secret sin. But then Jesus appears to her eventually and basically tells her he's there for her, and then kind of goes up into the sky. And after that, she starts having this kind of visionary life. She starts dressing in white, which is a sign that she's supposed to be kind of chaste, but she's still living with her husband. This upsets people. She decides to be vegetarian. This really upsets people. Nobody likes it.
She's so modern. She would be totally like an Instagram influencer today.
Yeah, especially since at some point Jesus tells her to eat meat, that she can eat meat. So she's like, okay, well, I'll eat. It would be more convenient at this point. So thank you, God. So she starts eating meat, and everybody thinks she's a hypocrite. She's very modern.
Go back to Woody Allen. It's like when in radio days, the Jewish uncle is very hungry, right? And during the fasting period, he sees that the neighbors are making barbecue and just like sausages, and he goes over and eats there, and then comes back to the house and he's like, now I'm a Marxist now.
And then she tells her husband that she'd like to not have sex anymore. And that essentially,
I read that he took that really well. He was really open to this idea. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, given that he says to her, would you rather that my head be cut off or not have sex with me? And she says, well, I'd rather your head be cut off. So, and he's sad. John Kempe is sad. What that means for him, of course, is that he can no longer have sex, which is permitted either, right? That if they're going to have a lifetime without sex, he will never have sex again unless he's willing to sin. So it's bigger than it sounds to our ears. Yeah, so
I think he makes these conditions, right? That he will, finally
She-
will
with him.
abstain if she like makes him fish and every Friday, and if she pays his debts. It's very transactional. It's like, okay, I will live without sex for my whole life, but like pay my debts.
Yeah, and also, can we still eat together? I think it's very sweet. Yeah, so I mean, I think this is Margery, and I love Margery because I think everybody who encounters her finds her infuriating and also unforgettable. She has the book of her life written. She hires scribes to write her book because she says God told her to write a book, which I think is great authority to write a book when God tells you need to get this down. And so it's very much her perspective. I think it's very much her perspective on things, not that of the scribes. At one point, it switches into the first person almost by accident. And also, she's always talking about which men are good looking, even when it's completely irrelevant. So she's in the Holy Land on pilgrimage, and a good looking Saracen helps her out. Why do we need to know that the Saracen is good looking? Well, because it's Margery telling this story. She'd like us to know. So there's that. But she's also, she's fame obsessed. She's really obsessed with people knowing her story. She's obsessed.
Instagram. She's an Instagram.
No, this is what I find so amazing. I've been working on a project on celebrity in the Middle Ages, and she's so perfect because preachers will preach about her without mentioning her name, but it'll get around to her, and everybody knows that they're referring to her. And she talks about this in her book. She's basically subtweeted in the early 15th century. And she's like a little fame machine. She goes all over the place and tells everybody her story over and over again so that they know about her life.
An instinct in this woman, right?
Yeah.
Like she gets it.
She also gets that being hated is as powerful as being loved. And God tells her over and over again, the more that people hate you, the more I love you.
This God was basically her manager.
In a way, yeah. I think he tells her what she would really like to hear. I think he's the wish fulfillment. This is my, very secular reading of it. I don't think she actually talked to God. I think God very conveniently fills in the gaps for her, what she would like to hear.
I would love to go and debunk a couple of things that I believe people generally assume about the Middle Ages. And I feel that her life could be an interesting kind of entry point. The first one is I think, see medieval people as relatively fatalistic. So somebody pursuing their fame in this very ambitious kind of way is already a sign of, what's going on. I would love to hear about that. The second question is about kind of the saint versus the witch. Like whenever you read about Kempe, you're like, why wasn't she burnt? And I would love to. I know that we have a complete misunderstanding about witch burnings and trials, also like location, the actual date of these things. So how did she survive? I mean, she was attacked numerous times, right? So she did have danger in her life, and she had to navigate it. So I would love to hear about that. And the third one is we assume that mystics who have visions have deep beliefs. And it seems like with Margery, this too is kind of the jury's out. So do you want to maybe first talk about just being agentic, to use the kind of tech bro type? Like what made her so autonomous to stand up to her husband, to write a book about her life? Like she was a very first principles thinker, as it seems to me.
Well, I think the problem with the Middle Ages is that we just don't have the fullness of sources that we have later. I think that's really the issue. And then instead of the sources, we have a ton of stereotypes. And the stereotypes, I mean, you said at the beginning, did the Middle Ages exist? Well, no, of course, they did not. The term is invented after, as a way of, humanists and people in the Renaissance kind of imagining a time between the classical period and the present, And his Petrarch is the big figure who's really thinking of himself in this as being in this transitional period. And then in the Renaissance, it's sort of retro defined, right? It's this middle period, which is, of course, has to be worse than the Renaissance, because the Renaissance then is the great rebirth, right? So things
It's another complete.
Yeah. And it's a myth.
I think that the Renaissance was like a feminist era, or
Yeah, it's a complete myth. I think what you have are some fantastic things that happened in the early modern period. The witch burnings, most of those happen in the wake of the Reformation. They're post-medieval. There are, they do start during the Middle Ages, but most of them are post-medieval. So the Harvard scholar James Simpson has worked on this. For example, we think of it as a medieval thing because they kind of, you have witches and
Monty Python,
yeah, you have them, that bring out your dead, and the sort of that Middle Ages, that Monty Python Middle Ages. But actually, it really becomes an issue in the early modern period. It's not to say there are none.
There's a kind of overreaction, a fear reaction to things changing, women becoming more powerful, etc., etc.
Margery is threatened with burning, but as a lollard, as a heretic. It's not as a witch. So it's really because she's going around preaching and teaching, and as a woman, she's not allowed to do that. But lollards support, one thing they support is the translation of the Bible into the vernacular, and they are more open to women preaching and teaching.
Terrible idea. Why have them understand what they're saying, right? Like, who wants that?
Well, here's the thing. I think we imagine, or many people imagine, the medieval period as being this kind of, the word slavish is not very nice, but just unthinking obedience to the church and to the Bible. And the fact that people can't read the Bible seems to be a sign of that. But you can take that in two ways, right? When people can't read the Bible, it's because the Bible needs to be interpreted for them, and it's because they're not supposed to read the Bible literally. This is the big fear in the Middle Ages around the Bible being available to everyone, that people will read it literally, and they'll think, okay, the patriarchs have multiple wives, that means I can too. Or we could do, especially with the Hebrew Bible, there's some things going on in there that are not particularly ideal. Well, maybe we could do those things, right? This is the great fear. What you have with the idea that you would read the Bible and follow it to the letter is a modern idea. And it actually is, in its own way, quite oppressive, right? So if you really followed the Bible literally, you would never wear mixed textiles. That's not allowed. Homosexuality is not allowed, right? Lots of things are.
Let's not stone astrologers and people who get tattoos, is what you mean, right? Like, yeah.
There are a lot of things so if you interpret the Bible, you create some space around what's allowed as well, right? It can go in both ways. It can be a way of domination, but it can always also be a way of opening things up. Anyway, so yeah, she's
famous. She works super hard on being famous and staying famous, defying a lot of expectations, risking being called a heretic, risking, using the hatred in this like optimal way for herself. And it's just generally this super special person at a time.
But here's the other thing that I think is
right. Like there are statistics. It's a very dense, saturated market, and she wins.
Yeah. Well, she doesn't win because she's not a saint. She never gets made into a saint. But I think that, and I think she really is angling for sainthood, but because she has miracles in her story, she's going for it. But here's the thing about her, which I find so fascinating, is the modern perspective, or at least many of my students tend to think when they're first coming to medieval studies, people that were very religious and they did whatever the church told them and they believed what the church told them, right? I think that's the stereotype. And what's fascinating, okay, Margery's not the church, but she's a mystic. She's presenting these kinds of miraculous visions that she's getting, and people are very skeptical. She's skeptical about the church authorities, and they're skeptical towards her. To the point where, she has these sort of crying fits where she falls on the ground and she sort of, her body moves uncontrollably, and it's very dramatic and attention-getting. At one point, a couple of priests follow her somewhere and watch her when she's praying in private to see if she also has a crying fits when other people aren't looking. They're very concerned with things being fake, right? Even as there's a belief in miracles,
That's such an interesting, again, kind of go against the assumptions here, because you think all medieval people were so gullible.
No.
It was anybody came and said something, and then you realize, like, no, they were just like us.
Some people were gullible and some people were not. And some people were critics and skeptical. They're skeptical. You have, in the 12th century, Guibert of Nogent writes about the cult, the relic cult, you know. Not all relics are real. They know this. They know because
in Belgium, you have these churches, right? The medieval churches, like in the film In Bruges. But like you think that's fiction, and then you drive around Belgium and go into these beautiful, beautiful old medieval churches, and then there's somebody's like finger and tooth in this like bejeweled case, and it's like it's cannibalism and like grave robbery. I don't know how, like we're like, are we going to worship a bone from a finger? Like
it's a conduit, Anna. It's a conduit to the divine.
It's so weird. It's so contrary to this whole idea of logos. Like, we don't worship the body, right? That we are bigger than that. Not Belgium. They are not bigger.
Oh, but you know, I think that's the thing. So in every society, you have people who kind of are ready to believe whatever is fed to them, and you have people who are skeptical and point out the hypocrisies and the lapses in logic. And the Middle Ages had them too. And so that's what I love about the life of Margery Kempe, is that you see someone really trying for sainthood, going around telling her story, talking about these visions she had with God. They also think some visions are fake and inspired by the devil, right? So there's always this doubt built into things as well. And people just doubt her. People doubt her, or some people hate her. Some people love her. It's not a monolith, right? I think that's what I love about her text, is it shows us society is not one. People just have very different reactions to her, and they change through her life as well. And I think that's more like what people were. But we get these little slivers of text, which show us maybe the church position on a certain point. And then
was there a big like historical change throughout her life in terms of church position, in terms of like historical events? I mean, she didn't die that young, right? So
no, she lived at least into her 60s.
But do you categorize her life as like unfolding in one period, or was there a period shift in between?
I don't really think of history in that way. Sorry.
No, I mean,
I don't think periods really shift that way. Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I can't, probably a church historian could answer that. I'm sure a church historian would point to something more relevant about developments in doctrine. But it's not visible in her life, in her story, if I could say that. Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about this competition among people to become saints? Because theoretically, we all know that, incentives will, determine the outcome. But how should we imagine a world where people potentially compete with each other to be made saints? Like, how does that work?
I don't think people competed with each other to be made saints, but I think they followed in the footsteps of other saints quite consciously. I think they imitated saints. And of course, you were never supposed to say you were angling for sainthood, because that would be proud, right? That would be potentially sinful. But you see people quite consciously following in the footsteps of saints. The hermits will often mention the lives of the fathers, and they're thinking of the desert saints in late antiquity in Egypt, Jordan, Syria. So they are thinking very much in terms of, how do I shape my life to be like the life of a particularly holy person? And that comes up over and over and over again. But I don't think they're competing with each other, because there's not a limit. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not like if one person becomes a saint, the next person can't. In the sense, all saints are supposed to be God, conduits to God. They don't have power on their own. And so there's no reason why God can't just have more saints, right? They're just holy people in a sense. So
it's not a zero-sum game. I love that. But
no.
The people who want to become saints, they are kind of competing against themselves, right? For better.
Well, you need recognition. I think this is the thing. You can't really be a saint in the Middle Ages without other people recognizing you as a saint. Like if a saint falls in the forest and nobody's there, to see the saint get back up again. That's not a miracle, right? So you know, so in
You
the
have
early
to like publicly heal people. And it's so
yeah,
funny that despite this, another contradiction, these priests follow Margery home to see what she does when people are not looking. So you have simultaneously this burden to perform well publicly, but when you
also
perform
privately.
too well, there are doubts.
Yeah, I think the visions wouldn't necessarily have qualified her for sainthood on their own, but she also talks about predicting the future, or sort of being told by God what will happen in the future several times in the book. So those would be miracles, for example.
And did her prophecies come true?
She claims they did.
Ah, okay, okay. So she was there, the prophecy.
Yeah, she says, and then so and so died or didn't die, or so and so got better. At one point, a monk, she runs into a very aggressive monk, and she basically tells him what sins he's guilty of, and he's so taken aback that he then reforms.
That's I mean, probably you can guess, right?
Yeah. Well, she says, I think this is the month. She says, have you've sinned with women, and he says, have I sinned with married women or with single ones? And she says, with married women, and then he goes, okay, she knows exactly what kinds of women I've been messing around with. This must be the real deal. So again, even the monk is skeptic, right? They're all skeptical. They're skeptical of this visionary in their midst. And that's not unique in the Middle Ages, although I think it's boldest with Margery, because she tells us the warts and all story of her life. And she's making a list of the skeptics as well as of the believers. Yeah. The other stereotype is that women didn't like sex or weren't sexual or
oh my God. And then you read Margery and you think, wow, these people were way wilder than we are.
Yes. Yeah.
Want to talk about Margery's love life just a little bit?
Well,
given that we just to debunk some of the stereotypes that the only way to be angling for sainthood would have been to go into a nunnery at age 12. Just look at the wall.
Well, it's a better way. I don't recommend Margery's way. It doesn't seem to have worked very well. But she's married her whole life, and she it's not clear from much of her book if she enjoys relations with her husband or not, because in many of their conversations it's about how disgusted she is with sex and how much she doesn't want to have sex with him anymore. But at the end of the book, there's this really moving and sad chapter which describes how he becomes incontinent in his old age and senile. He's basically demented and incontinent, and she's forced to take care of him and clean up his clothing and so on when he soils it. And she's very upset. She really doesn't like it. She doesn't pretend to be particularly caring. She says she'd rather be in contemplation of God. But she sees it as her punishment because in their youth she took such pleasure in his body. And it's such an amazing moment of a married woman talking about the pleasures of married sex. She also tries to have an affair at one point with a guy who approaches her rather obnoxiously on the eve of St. Margaret's Day when she's going to church. She's going to evensong, actually, and he basically propositions her, and she is so overwhelmed by desire for him, and really more by the obsession, that then she goes to him and she says, okay, you could do whatever you want with me. And he is then disgusted and doesn't want anything to do with her. And at one point,
back to a cat collar.
Yeah.
No, I didn't mean that. That's just exactly. Stop by stay in church in front of other people. Like, don't take me seriously.
And then the wildest bit is she has a moment where she is, I think if I remember correctly, she doubts God for a while. And in order to punish her, God allows the devil to tempt her. And the devil gives her a vision where she sees all of these men of different faiths presenting their genitals to her. And she has to choose
for this called Burning Man, where you can do this.
She has to choose whether she will be with one of them or be common to all. And she has this vision for a while. It's not really a quick vision. And then at some point it's taken away so that she can realize God's power. And I think, wow. She has very interesting visions with
it's wild. We are saying this for a reason. You're hearing this from a great medieval literary scholar here. Irina Dumitrescu wants you to read this and then just like tweet about it and tag us because we want to participate in your awe and wonder.
There's a great translation for Oxford World's Classics by Anthony Bale. You can
we'll add it to the description.
Yeah.
Let's talk about doubt. I think, the whole title for this episode is, can we understand the people of the past? Can we understand medieval people? And, we go through all these assumptions and kind of misunderstanding or instances of misunderstanding when it comes to the medieval mind. And one is that everybody was deeply religious. And everybody followed the scripture really well. Everybody tried to avoid sin. At the same time, also people were kind of assholes and there's so many contradictions. Like we don't know what to think, right? And one thing that we relatively rarely discuss, and my theory is that it is because we actually have a hard time modeling their minds, because their minds were far more religiously shaped, even if not religious in adulthood because of doubts, but it's the doubt that we don't understand. So when it comes to Margery, who is famous as this mystic, in whose chambers Jesus drops by all the time to like impart wisdom and manage her career, and then, in your explorations, you do say that she doubted even these visions. So how did these visions come to her first? Because I think that's an important moment. How did it unfold and what made her doubt them? And in an age that we assume was much more accepting of visions, not yet having notions of schizophrenia or ergotism and other common causes for having these visions.
Well, I think really she's supposed to, first of all, she has them when she has this pregnancy, right? When this pregnancy is very difficult. And at least the way the book is set up, it seems that she then starts to have these elaborate visions afterwards. I think she has them, I would say a lot of scholars would say she has them partly because she reads about them in books. So she reads about other people's visions. She reads about St. Bridget's visions.
It's a Girardian thing, right?
She seems to have the books read to her, but she's very literate not in the sense of necessarily of reading the books with her own eyes, but she's very familiar with the content of a lot of books. She has Richard Roll's Fire of Love read to her, it seems. So she's, she has a sense of how the visions are supposed to be, right? That you're supposed to feel heat, hear music, for example. There are all these qualities which scholars have gone through and sort of shown, okay, there are predecessors for all of her visions. They don't come out of nowhere. She's reading the books and then she's having visions by the book, in a way. And then sometimes when people doubt
what
her...
a good line, having visions by the book.
Yeah, and then sometimes when people doubt her, it's only when they then read the lives of other visionaries that they see, oh, okay, she's supposed to be crying like that. That's normal, right? So she's being judged by the book too. So you have to imagine this is all in a cultural context where you're getting ideas about how to be a visionary from people and also from books. And then that shapes your religious experience, right? I don't think she's lying about having the visions, but I think what they were would have been shaped by the culture she was in.
What does she have? What happens to her?
She hears music. She has a long vision where she is helping the Virgin Mary at the Nativity and acting as a kind of servant, arranging the hostel, arranging for the clothes for the newborn baby. And this is a great honor to her that she can sort of serve her in this way. She has a very long vision of the crucifixion, which is very standard in the Middle Ages. You're supposed to, imagine, if you're a high level of faith, imagine being at the crucifixion, feeling all the sorrow, watching, Jesus being tortured and dying. So she has a long vision like that. And at one point, she has a marriage with God. And God, essentially, they have a marriage ceremony. And it seems they cuddle up in bed. So it's a very eroticized, right? She has a very eroticized relationship with God. She has lots of conversations with
Which is very common. I mean, Umberto Eco writes
it's
like
absolutely common. Yeah.
cults of women who just like wanted to sleep with Jesus.
Or they had spiritual pregnancies, which were shown on the body. I mean, there were all kinds of Barbara Newman.
Real babies as well.
Yeah.
Look like the neighbor. Yeah. Just all stuff.
But sometimes also just pregnancies that disappeared because they were only spiritual. Yeah. So
okay, so she has some kind of mystical aptitude.
Yeah. But here's the thing.
Depression, schizophrenia, we don't know. Plus, she reads about this stuff, but she still doubts them. So what is it?
Because you're supposed to doubt them. That's the thing. And they believe that visions can be divine or caused by the devil. And so the trick, if you're having visions, is to figure out which one it is. And that's part of the reason she goes around telling everyone about her visions, or at least that's what she claims. She's always asking them if they're real or not, if they're demonic or divine. She goes to Julian of Norwich. So we have these two figures who actually meet. And one of the things she asks, she tells her visions and asks if they're demonic or not. So that's in other books too, right? I think it's Walter Hilton who writes a book on the scale of perfection, or the ladder of perfection, how to become perfect. He writes too, visions can be demonic. They're not automatically good. They can be false, right? So the doubt is kind of kicked in, or into the system, and in that way, you are supposed to doubt. You are not supposed to just go around having visions and think that you're talking to God without being authorized by other people, having other people check them and tell you.
The whole point of the Inquisition originally was not, as we assume, to like burn and torture people, but to examine these claims, right? So you would bring your vision, your claim, your numinous experience to this tribunal, basically, that was almost really like a court, and they would examine the validity of these things, right? But also for your benefit, because you don't want to be possessed by, like, the no one expects the slaves. Go back to Monty Python. Like, there's a Monty Python undercurrent to this episode. I mean, for a reason. Would that be correct as a statement? That's
I just haven't researched the Inquisition enough to tell you. Yeah.
That has
a big topic. I would hate to talk about it. Yeah.
Okay. We'll get an Inquisition scholar on this podcast.
Yeah.
The Hope Axis. It will be so on brand. Just let's talk about torture.
I think this also centuries of history. I mean, it's a really complex topic. Yeah.
But that's maybe that's the most interesting. I mean, of course, there's like private life and lifestyle, and society related questions where we are grossly misunderstanding what the medieval period was really like. But I think when it comes to this skepticism, which we so associate with the ancients, we so associate with not even the Renaissance, but more like the scientific revolution and and like, when that would have been when we invented this faculty of reasoning. And no,
but it sometimes comes out in different ways in terms of the medieval works that we still have. So sometimes, a not untypical thing is that the skepticism will be put into the mouth of a Jew. So you have dialogues, for example, about
that is still the case, by the way. That's why you need to read Jewish authors.
But I think that's the medieval way of entertaining an argument against some aspect of the faith, right? Is to have a Jewish figure question it. And then of course, the Christian always wins the debate, right? But, if you think about it as an encoded form of writing, then you realize that you've just actually had a figure present arguments against a certain aspect of the faith. So there's something, the medieval love for dialogue.
I'm wondering, right? Like somebody who doesn't live there, so who can come in as the stranger.
Or just a Jewish character, just a nameless, like a dialogue between a Christian and a Jew. It doesn't have to be made into a whole character. You have a lot of problems in the Middle Ages with people believing in the doctrine of the Eucharist. So the doctrine of the Eucharist is that the bread and blood believing Christians receive during Mass truly becomes the body and blood of Christ, right? You have to believe that because it tastes like bread and wine. Sorry, I said bread and blood. I mean,
Is it
bread
the
and
homoousion versus homoousion?
It is, yeah. It's the whole, it in the substance and the accidents, right? Like the internal truth of it is that it actually becomes the body and blood of Christ, but it's accidents, the sort of the qualities that you can sense with your senses, still make it resemble wine and bread, right? So it's an absolute
cannibalism.
No,
No cannibalism.
well, but kind of is if it's done right, right? So it's such a matter. You're being asked to believe that something in your mouth has transformed into something else, even though it tastes the same. It's such a demanding request for faith, and it's so difficult that what you get are all of these miracle stories that are meant to prove that the Eucharist is true. You get plays, you get all kinds of stories that are trying to prove it, and often it is some person, some disbelieving Jew who comes and tries to stab the Eucharist and it bleeds. And that's how it really is the body of Christ and not just a wafer. But I think, when you look at
normal stuff,
it's Christian doubt.
Yeah.
It's Christian doubt displaced onto Jewish figures, even in some communities where there are no Jews. But Jews are used to carry the Christian doubt, essentially, where there's not a speakable way of expressing that doubt.
Important social function.
But look, this is the thing. I think a lot of people today, if they grow up in fundamentally free political systems, have trouble understanding how people communicate in fundamentally unfree systems. They do not understand the level of encoding that has to happen when you have a large power structure that keeps you from saying whatever you want. And so they look for a variety of opinion that's really obvious in order to believe that there was a variety of opinion. Whereas you would have to look at it in an encoded way. You'd have to look at what's said between the lines. The same way as is true for a lot of the Eastern Bloc, right? People learned to say things in coded ways when there was a Securitate ready to jump on them if they said things openly. And other people learn to read the codes. But if you come from outside and you don't understand how to read those codes, and this is where Leo Strauss, I think, is useful. If you don't understand how to read those codes, you think there's nothing there. And that's where I think we have doubt in the Middle Ages. If you don't understand that people are encoding it into various kinds of texts, that they're dancing around it, that they're gesturing to it, it's very easy to think it's not there. I mean, this is not, scholars are quite clever about this. I'm not saying this about my colleagues at all. I think my colleagues are very much onto what's going on in these texts. But the cartoon version of the Middle Ages doesn't have that in it because it just takes the surfaces of things.
I completely concur with the East Bloc note. And I did write, so Scott Aronson has a couple of incredibly good pieces on the kind of common knowledge situation under dictatorships, which I think people don't understand. And today, what we're witnessing in America raises the question of how much we should educate people about this, because you don't want to create a system like that even by accident. Yeah. And that's just generally really, really interesting. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago called 3 Prologues to Language, right? To talk. I mean, I approach it more from like a woke perspective, because wokeism also carries its own forms of censorship. But that's really quite interesting. What is the most important thing encoded in Margery Kempe that would have been accessible to somebody in her own period who understands the code, but for which now we need medieval scholars like yourself to help us understand what she meant?
That's a great question. I think I'll tell you what I have noticed more recently about her book that it took me a lot of readings to notice, and that I haven't seen made explicit in the literature, which is how much her book is filled with doubt, actually. I think we think, okay, this woman got scribes to write down her life story. She is describing all of these visions of God. She must have been really convinced, right? She seems absolutely insufferable sometimes with her vegetarianism and her weird clothing and her, she doesn't follow the rules. She does all these things, and it's always because God told her to. So, she must have been convinced. And yet, the last rereading, I realized how much doubt comes up over and over again. I have a secret theory that that's the unconfessed sin at the beginning. But also because God tells her sometimes, don't doubt me. He says, I'm there for you. Why do you doubt? It comes up over and over again. And I think it's hard for us to imagine that someone would, on the one hand, make a monument to their sanctity, and at the same time, memorialize so much of their doubt.
And this is not the kind of doubt that we discussed earlier, which is a doubt in your own visions, but this is a doubt in the existence of God.
I don't know if it's a doubt in the existence of God. I think it's probably it's a doubt as to whether God will be there for her. I think that's what she doubts. Because that's, in a way, when Jesus comes down to her when she's sort of, tied up so that she won't hurt herself, he says, essentially he says, why don't you think I am there for you? I've always been there for you. So I think she doubts in his aid, in his comfort. She doubts that he will help her.
Right. So, okay.
Which in a way is doubting God, right? Because it's believing that God doesn't care about you, but
doubting the intervention.
Yeah. Doubting the role of God in your life. So I think that seems to be what, it's almost like her God is constantly assuring her, no, I do love you. I am there for you. I will help you. I will watch out for you. Don't worry. I am there for you. She's kind of a worrier in a funny sort of way. And I think that's very in the fun. She has this God who keeps telling her what she wants to hear, and yet she can't quite believe it. I find that fascinating, the way she's made
such cases, right?
Yeah.
Many such cases.
Many cases.
That's fascinating. Yeah, before we hit the record button, we were talking about Strauss and Maimonides, and he has this notion that another medieval religious figure, this time a Jewish figure, also kind of sprinkles his writing with very severe expressions of doubt, and then it's kind of hidden under this facade of the received way of genre writing at the time.
I think that's lots of places. Yeah.
Who are people that our listeners should be reading about Margery Kempe? I mean, you mentioned the actual text and its translation. Are there good books about her? What can people read by you about her? How, like, if somebody wants secondary literature, where should they start?
There's a pretty recent book by Anthony Bale called Margery Kempe Mixed Life, and that gives sort of the historical context. I think most of the things I have in mind are pretty academic, and maybe not as accessible or not as broad. But the Bale book is meant for a smart general audience. It's got a lot of detail in it, but it's accessible as well.
Maybe there should be a movie about her.
But I have another tip, actually, which is completely different and absolutely wild. Robert Gluck, the American writer Robert Gluck, wrote, I think in the late 80s or early 90s, wrote a book called Margery Kempe, which the New York Review of Books republished a few years ago. So you can now get it. It was sort of a very difficult book to get for a while. And he intertwines a story of a relationship he was having with a younger man who was very aloof and rich and beautiful with Margery Kempe's affair with Jesus. When I tell my students about it, I say, look, it is the most sexually explicit thing I've ever read in my life. You read it at your own,
That's why you have to leave America. That's why you have to teach in Europe. This is the true story of how Irina left.
My students can trigger too. I see, baby, if you choose to read this is on you. I have warned you. It is
I'm
completely.
going to add the link in the description. Guys, do yourself a favor.
But it's so brilliant because you know what he did? He basically, I think he's a fantastic reader of Margery Kempe. I think he's one of the best readers of Margery Kempe. He's really read that book. And he brings a version of the late 14th, early 15th century alive in all of the bodies of the people present. And the way he did that was he had his friends in his sort of artistic group write down secret things about their own bodies. And then he incorporated these details into the narrative.
Oh, I love it.
So that they're
Gillian Anderson's book called Want, which is just women anonymous messages that they have.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very similar thing. And so basically his community becomes kind of incorporated into the bodies of Margery Kempe's community. And there's just something so raw about it. I think Anthony Bale's book is very, measured and careful and contextualizes everything and makes her seem very normal in a way. And Robert Gluck makes her seem, I think he catches that desire in her, the passion and the sort of uncontrollability of it and how radical it was, But it's worth reading. It is very much riches.
That's so interesting. I mean, I think, from previous Interact events that we did, that for me, when it comes to novelists, Hilary Mantel is my go-to person, who I think did the best job, particularly in the first Wolf Hall book, but to some degree in A Place of Greater Safety, where she shows you the mindset of the people, say, in the 1800s, without losing the kind of modern rhythm and cadence and accessibility, which is impossible to do. That is so hard in historical fiction or even nonfiction, to make you be able to kind of identify with Henry VIII's motives, but understand their mind. Like, what happens to people who actually believe in hell? What happens to people to read Hamlet, of people who don't commit suicide, right? Like, to be or not to be, because you don't know what's awaiting after. And that was an actual thought, at least on the doubting level, even in the minds of the most scientifically trained, independent-minded, autistic people of the Middle Ages, and up to quite late, right? Like, into modernity. And I always find, like, the reason why we can't read history well, because we just don't understand. And
who's we? I think a lot of people believe in hell. General
reading public. What we do in historical writing is we basically change characters into modern characters.
Yes. Yeah.
Give them a modern framework, modern morality, and then kind of add a few elements to show.
Yeah.
Like, to approach from this other, Echo is amazing at it. Like, what did these people really think? And so when I read about Kempe, and when I read your work as well, like, you try to kind of, to quote Mantel, create a world that you can inhabit, right? That this was a different world. Would you agree with that?
I try to get under their skin. That's how I think of it. I try to get under their skin, and I'm attracted to the figures where I have enough information that I can begin to try to do that, right? So where I have a sense of the personality and the conflicts and the things that don't make sense and the longings and the secrets that they're giving away. I'm attracted to those figures in particular. But I have to say, I would never claim that I have the answer, right? Because they're just so far away, and it's still, I think you can live with a person for decades and not really know what they're thinking at any given moment. Or even if you know most of the time, you might not know this one time. And so I think ultimately it is impossible to know another person. You're always going to be projecting, but I try to mold my projection as much as possible based on the text or the information that I have. It's always going to be a little bit of projection. I don't think you can really get really understand how they thought. Because what I do think we can say, what I would argue, I break a lance for, as it were, is that they were not all the same. And that's where I think people today have trouble with. They imagine, okay, medieval people must have been like this, or people in the 18th century must have been like this, or this was the mood, this was the period, and so they were like this. And I would argue hard for them being different, but their full difference just not coming down to us in ways that we can read and understand. I think this is a fundamental thing that people need to learn how to do, is also when looking at other countries, understanding that not everybody in that country believes the same thing or supports what their government does, right? I think we need that. For some reason, this is very hard for people to understand, right? That large groups of people are not all the same. Even quite intellectual, well-educated people have trouble really getting that. And so that's what I'd argue for, that if you took 5 people from the, I don't know, 12th century France or Paris and put them in one room, chances are they'd be arguing with each other. Because that's what they actually argued with each other all the time. We know this. We know they argue with each other. That's what they would be doing, because people are different and have different opinions.
And I always try to imagine how we will be seen, in 800 years, when people will be describing 2025. If you imagine how much generalization there will be, how much we will be dumped into similar geographies and categories and generation, and how offended you would be by that. How do you get under the skin of people? And how do you think people will get under our skins, as a kind of close be aligned with the Hope Access theme?
I read books that are life writing. I think anything that has a kind of life writing. I teach the books and I talk about them with my students, and I read them over and over. And it's a kind of empathetic exercise in the way, just as some of them imagine themselves being at the crucifixion or helping the Virgin Mary in Bethlehem, I imagine myself next to them. I think, we can't apply modern psychology necessarily wholesale to medieval people, but sometimes they have very interesting dreams that they tell you about, or details about their parents' sex life. And then, you kind of get a lot of information about them. So sometimes they confess, right? They tell you things. And will it get you to the true person? No, but it'll help you get a little bit closer. It gets you closer to a version of themselves that they wanted to communicate. How will they get under our skin? I think in a way, and maybe this is something the modern period has in common with the Middle Ages, I think an awful lot of our textual remains will disappear. They have been getting more fragile since the early 19th century, when you start to have paper that's treated with acid. So this is why an 18th century book is really solid. The paper is so solid. It's made with cotton, cotton. They're strong.
There will be more 18th century books left.
Yeah. 19th century books sometimes just fall apart in your hands, right, when you open them, because the paper is so fragile. And what we have are even more fragile. They will not find letters for most of us, right? Our emails will be gone. Our chats will be gone. Many of our books might disappear, especially if they're only digitally published. I think we're living in a moment right now where we can see how quickly things can disappear. I'm thinking of the British Library scans, manuscript scans, which were lost due to essentially a criminal action. I'm thinking of the way that major dictionaries go offline.
But also floods. I mean, the fire in California destroyed multiple libraries.
We are going to lose an incredible amount of data about our lives. And so I really wonder what future and I think current historians also wonder about it, because people from the 1950s will be sometimes easier to trace. It'll be easier to trace their thoughts and lives than with us. We're going to be a little bit like the Middle Ages, in the sense that we're going to leave very little and very unrepresentative material from our lives.
And maybe on the object level, a little bit like the antiques, right? I always think about like somebody finds my AirPods. I don't know. And
What are they going to find? Our IKEA furniture?
yeah, and there's like this female figurine, and people are like, "Oh, this was a fertility goddess," and it was a doll for a girl, or like a pinup for the soldiers. It was, like the Rosetta Stone is a grocery.
Most of us don't have items that are built to last, so those won't last either. Our furniture won't last. Our clothing won't last. It's really amazing. If you start to think about it, it's actually kind of terrifying. But,
that's terrifying.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting thought. And I know that there is the Vesuvius project. My friend John Evans is bringing code to Antarctica. There are people who are trying to buy Greenland. So there are some attempts to create something more monumental. But we are living in a very fragile era that really only will be preserved in any way whatsoever to give testimony of our lives and what we were up to and our diversity and our disagreements if we actually invest in something permanent. I was thinking about the Voyager record, which is a trauma for me because the Hungarian sentence on Carl Sagan's Voyager record is messed up and it has a grammar error. And if I really want to work myself up very quickly, I just think about some alien getting this and listening and having a complete misunderstanding about Hungarian suffixes. To me, that's unbearable as a thought. But we're not even doing that. That was in the 70s. We're not even doing that. It's terrible. So maybe one thing we should learn and take to heart at the end of this
make a few things that last.
Learn from the medieval scholar Irina Dumitrescu and create things that last. Yeah. Not memes, not genes. Those are great things to pass on. Yes. Create objects that in some ways will last without a charger, without a whole Apple ecosystem. What is there to build?
Yeah.
Amen. Thank you so much for listening. Irina, you're the best. And everybody read about the spiritual and love life of Margery Kempe and then let us know what you thought.
Thank you, Anna.